Celeste is going to be doing her mediation.
I want to join us all together for September 25th, 2017. Apologize for being late. I just came down from Santa Rosa.
Okay, ready. Trustee Holding. Trustee Monette.
He's going to be late.
Trustee Morgan.
Yes.
Clerk Ferrucci. Here. President Wing.
Here. Will you all please rise and join me in pledge allegiance? I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So this is a board workshop study session, and we're going to kind of go informal. Unless it gets too carried away, then we'll have to bring it back in and follow Robert rules of order. But hopefully, I'd like to just have Robert from School Services to present, and just kind of like how we were last time. Is just, you know, if you have questions, raise your hand. You know, give everybody the opportunity to speak and ask their questions, and also, you know, this is time for all of us to learn. And I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Young. And
yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a good tee up. I appreciate that. So again, I'd like to welcome Robert Miyashiro from School Services of California. Robert presents at the Capitol level. And is a leader in his organization, and you presented with us a number of years ago. And so again, as Trustee Wing said, this is an opportunity for us to, you know, take a close look at budget trends and things that are happening in the economy, locally, regionally, nationally, and talk about them, how they play themselves out in public education and how they play out in Benicia. Robert has quite a bit of data here. He's some comparisons from a number of other school districts, all of the school districts in Solano County and others. So again, as Trustee Wing said, this is conversational. Yeah.
Yep. Being that we are a official meeting too. Somebody, do we have a motion to approve our agenda? There you go.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
I approve. I second it.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Opposed? Okay, sorry about that.
No worries. No, I thought you were going to tell me I was talking too much.
No, just trying to keep us moving, and as I'm trying to get the computer running. So.
But we've gone through the presentation. There's quite a bit in here. And again, I don't think it'll afford us an opportunity to do a deep dive into all things budget. And the association is here representing. So we're glad that you're here, and we welcome you to be, you know, part of this conversation. And we'll have a dialogue. And we talked about this earlier about how we want to do the presentation. And I think, Robert, your thought was that you'll go through it with some exchange, knowing that he has quite a bit of information. We want to give ourselves an opportunity to get through all of it. But does that work for you?
Sure, that works fine.
Okay. All right. So we're ready to go. Any questions from the trustees before we get started?
Any questions from anybody out there?
Okay, well, thank you very much, President Wing, trustees, Superintendent Young. Again, Robert Miyashiro with School Services of California, and I think this is the third time I've presented before you. And what I've tried to do each time is kind of lay out some kind of a general framework for what the economy is looking like, and more importantly, what state revenues are looking like, because then that helps give us some sense of where we're headed in January, what we might expect. And then from that more kind of broad view of the economy and state revenues, we'll talk about how Benicia kind of compares to other districts in the county, with regard to its revenue situation, and then some general measures of class size and so forth. Other topics that I've been asked to address, which I don't know that I got into last time around, was foundation funding, parcel tax, some thoughts on how to kind of build or guide your thinking on a reserve level. So those are kind of particular topics that weren't included last time around. And I certainly invite a dialogue as we go, both comments and questions. So feel free.
Just a quick point. We budgeted, if we have to go over it, we can, but we said somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 hours, so 5:30 to 7:30. We're 10 minutes into that. So just as a gauge for ourselves as we pace as we go along.
All right. So again, talk about some of the recent developments in California school finance. And so some of those are going to be relevant to kind of revenues and Proposition 98 and LCFF funding. But other things, I think, at least it's good to have on your radar now, because they are going to be big issues that won't go away in the next year or 2 years. The local control funding formula and how those monies are being spent. And then also I'll talk a little bit about this bill that's pending on the governor's desk on the cap on school district reserves, because particularly for your budgeting purposes, that has gotten a lot of attention. And then, as I mentioned, we'll do some comparisons of Venetia with other districts, discussion about prudent reserve policy, and then parcel taxes and education foundations. Okay, so now this is not the most timely, but the latest I have is a June quarterly report from UCLA economists. Unfortunately for the timing of this presentation, their third quarter forecast comes out tomorrow. So we're missing it. Well, it comes out on Wednesday, so we're missing it by 2 days. But I don't know that their overall story is going to change all that much. When I attended their last conference, they want to kind of give a guide to the risks to the broader economy, both California and national. And they acknowledge that this current recovery is old by historical standards. So we've only had one 10-year recovery during the Clinton-Bush expansion, but they are saying that there are no real signs that, notwithstanding how long the recovery has gone, that it's not really overheating. And so they specifically look at kind of early warning signs of maybe a downturn. They look at things like long-term interest rates relative to short-term rates. If those interest rates in the long term are kind of dropping, then that might signal some weakness in the longer-term outlook. They look at things like housing starts, and housing is a big barometer because a lot of spin-off spending follows housing. And while that's kind of a little bit weak, it's not in a downturn. It's nothing that's triggering kind of a red flag. So their overall comment is that the economy, while it's expanding slowly, it is not vulnerable to a near-term recession. Now, they will also acknowledge that, no one has a crystal ball that they can see things with 100% accuracy, but from their point of view, no recession on the immediate horizon. Now, what's important for state-funded programs, and schools being the biggest one, is, well, what's happening with the state of tax collections? So the latest report we had is for August revenues, and the big picture there is that the revenues, while August is not a really important month, did come in ahead of the expectation. Each of the major taxes up about $100 million each. And when you take a look at year-to-date revenues, meaning July and August, we're up about $475 million. Now, what I try to remind folks of when I give this presentation, particularly in the fall, is that last year we were in a hole already. We started the year in a hole, and then it got worse as the year went on, so that when we came to January, when the governor's budget came out, we had a downward revision in expected revenues. And we saw that coming during the course of the summer and the fall. I don't see that happening, at least right now. Things are tracking according to the May revision forecast, and so Nothing spectacularly high, but certainly not like last year, because last year at this time, we were down almost $900 million on the downside. So things got really bad, but this year, looking like they're tracking okay. Now, another kind of measure of how the economy is doing is just job growth. Are we creating jobs in California? Or are we shedding jobs in California? And these are, you figure, well, if people have jobs, then they're paying some level of income tax, they're buying things, sales tax, and so forth. So we kind of watch the monthly job report. And what I would say is that the last three reports, June, July, and August, kind of paint a pretty confusing picture. Because what you want to see for California over the long run is kind of job growth in the 10 to 15,000 jobs per month. So in that range, you're kind of absorbing population-related growth. Things are not getting better, but they're not getting worse. So you need to add jobs just to keep pace with inflation. And we look at what happened in June, July, and August. In June, we lost 1,400 jobs. In July, we gained almost 83,000 jobs. And then 1 month later, we lost 8,200 jobs. So it's very confusing. Are we falling behind, or are we really in a boom? And so to me, any one of these reports, you really can't put much stock in. The 3-month average gets you around 24,000 jobs. That's a pretty good number. But we will want to pay attention to that, because if we are having a downturn and businesses are no longer hiring and they see slack demand for their product and they're starting to let people go, well, that could tell us that a downturn's on the way, and maybe California is going to lead that. There's nothing of evidence of that, but I just point that out, that these numbers were bobbling around quite a bit the last 3 months, a little bit of confusion there. And you can see the unemployment rate, kind of edging up a little bit. And sometimes that unemployment rate edges up because people who are discouraged workers see jobs being added, 82,000 jobs, and they say, well, I need to re-enter the labor market and look for a job. Well, if they start looking, then they add to the unemployment rate because they haven't found a job yet, but they are looking. If you become a discouraged worker and you essentially don't look for a job, you fall out of the statistics altogether. So a little bit of interpreting what that unemployment rate really is meaning.
Robert, I was just noticing that that seems like a colossal shift from June to July.
It is.
82.
It's
I thought that was a typo, like it should be 8,000, but 82,000. Wow.
Yeah. So that's why, normally these numbers are kind of boring. I wouldn't really pay much attention to them, but I bring them to your attention because, they report these numbers on the day that it comes out, and it'll, make a little press or, something newsworthy, unemployment rate, edged up a little bit for California or edged down. The other number to look at, though, is did we add jobs or did we lose jobs? And so we're coming off a month of losing 8,000 jobs. Let's hope that it turns around and is more sustained gains.
Robert, do you have any idea what areas this job growth was in? Or?
Yeah, so from the month to month, it's a little hard to know. They do put out detailed reports. And in the general sense, we have been losing manufacturing jobs over the longer term. We have been adding kind of the lower paid service sector jobs. The government side has been edging up in the last few months. So it's a little bit of, some are falling behind, some are growing. I need to kind of go through the details to tell you which ones. But the broader trend has been construction really took a bad hit during the recession, and then we started to add back construction jobs. California manufacturing has been kind of on a long-term kind of decline, so it's a lot of pluses and minuses. But I'm not sure exactly where the big boost came in there on that July report. The national level, you can see the unemployment rate's a little more stable, which would make sense. So, at the national level, running about 4.4% unemployment rate, and the economists will generally tell you that that's a full employment economy. So you really aren't going to get your unemployment rate much lower than that over the long run, because there is just this natural kind of job turnover. People do lose their jobs, new jobs are created, and so in that mid-4 range, generally considered full employment. Now, the other measure at the national level that we do pay attention to and will also get reported in the news is the gross domestic product of the country. And so you get a quarterly number that comes out, and they'll say, GDP, was flat, GDP was up 1%, GDP was up 2%. And so I think what's important about this latest number is that it came in originally below 3%. It was at 2.4, then it was revised to 2.6%. And now the latest revision on that second quarter was that it was a 3% GDP growth. Now, that's not really all that significant historically. But over the last 10 years, even before this Great Recession, U.S. GDP kind of fell down to the 2% range. It fell off of the 3% long-term range, and we've been mired, in a sense, in that 2% range. And UCLA even commented on that we are kind of in this sluggish growth. Now, 3% historically would not be anything to write home about. But following roughly 10 years of 2, we get 3, and then we get third quarter of 3, and then the fourth quarter of 3. Maybe we're going to get back up to a little bit more sustainable, stronger growth rate. And just to kind of tie this into some of the federal policies being debated and proposed, the administration is proposing big tax cuts, big infrastructure spending, big defense outlays. And so the first level argument is that, well, if you have all of this level of spending and tax cuts, you're going to raise the federal deficit. And that would be true. But their assumption is that the economy moves from a 2% growth to a 3% growth. And at that 3% plus growth rate, they won't add to the deficit with these policies in place. So they all kind of tie together. There's an assumption that 3% will follow tax cuts and will follow infrastructure spending and so forth. So this is just a little picture of the quarterly GDP rates, and the 2017 orange bar is that latest second quarter growth of 3%. And you can see how back in 2015, we started off the year above 3%, then we fell down, kind of sluggish. We made a little bit of a move toward 3% last year and then fell down. And so it's not been able to be moving that 2.5% to 3.5% range. It's moving more in that 2% range. So again, a broad measure of the economy. And California represents, on round numbers, about 1/8 of the overall economy. So what happens nationally is a lot of what happens here, and vice versa.
Robert, just a quick question. From the economy, from 2% growth rate to a 3%, roughly how much does that equate in, like billions of?
I don't know off the top of my head. It probably, it's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions. Yeah. Okay, so if we go from kind of talking about the economy and state revenues to what matters to funding for California schools, and that would be Proposition 98 and then funding under the LCFF. Now, Proposition 98 is just a series of formulas in the state constitution that tell the legislature and the governor what is the minimum amount of money that needs to be appropriated to support K-12 and community colleges. So it sets up a minimum, and it's driven by population growth, meaning K-12 enrollment, and measures of inflation, meaning state general fund revenue growth or per capita personal income growth. So if we kind of take where we are to date and we look at, how are things performing compared to what was expected when the state budget was enacted, I would say things are pretty much tracking as expected. It's not falling below, and we aren't looking at a bonanza. So we're kind of tracking as expected. Now, if we're tracking as expected, the Department of Finance has told us what they would plan to do for 18-19. So it's still almost a year out, but the Department of Finance is saying, based on what we see, and things are tracking along what they were thinking, they would provide about $1.9 billion in funding for the local control funding formula. So those would be the new dollars available to all school districts in 18-19, according to that forecast that was made back in May. Now, what does $1.9 billion provide? Because this is, these are all round numbers, and you kind of have to take it, with an adjustment for Benicia. But in round numbers, it provides about $316 per ADA. But what we point out is that the forecast for inflation next year is a little over 2%. And in order just to cover that inflationary cost on LCFF is going to kind of consume, if you will, about $1.6 billion. So the real dollar gain is around $300 million statewide, because most of it is going to be taken up in inflation. Now, we'll get to this in more detail when we talk about the comparisons, but $316 is the increase for the average school district. And by that, under LCFF, I mean a district that's got an unduplicated pupil percentage of around 60 to 62%. So Benicia's is well below that. So your increase next year, if all the rest of these numbers hold, will not be 316. It's going to be lower than 316 because you have a lower unduplicated pupil percentage. So when we talk about averages under the LCFF, the next thing you have to think of is what is your unduplicated pupil percentage compared to the average of about 62. So if you're below 62, get less. Above 62, you get more. So what's covered is essentially the LCFF targets, base grant targets, are adjusted for inflation by an index that is calculated by the U.S. Department of Commerce. And so it's a dollar number that just gets adjusted. Now, how it's spent once it's received by districts is going to largely be on your base level costs. So, your base costs in a school district will rise with your step and column, your health, your person stirs, and so forth. So that's will be consumed by the dollars you receive.
So you have wages for employees as part of that.
Yeah, so just to be clear, that 2.15% is calculated based on what they call the state and local government deflator. And it's a national index calculated by the Department of Commerce, where they take essentially a market basket of wages paid, costs paid by all local governments across the entire country. So it's not unique to California. So the thinking behind it all was they didn't want administrations to manipulate that number. So they said, well, let's just make it tied to a national figure. And so that number is a national number based on wage and salary growth, utility costs, energy costs incurred by governments, not just schools, but counties, cities across the country. Yes, everything. So it's probably generally a good measure from California, but sometimes you'll look at that number and compare it to the California CPI, Consumer Price Index, specifically for California. Sometimes that number will be higher, sometimes it'll be lower because it's not unique to California. It's a national average.
Tim, I'm sorry, do you know what our annual inflator is for just step and column and just built-in expenses every year? Is that going to cover that, or are we getting it right every year? Right, our base goes up. Do we stay pace with what they're giving us to keep up, or do we fall behind, or do we go ahead?
Yeah, we do fall behind. There's a in the board packets with the budgets and the audited actuals, there's a page on about key fiscal factors, and so it delineates those automatic expenditures right before the
Automatic
state gives us-
increases.
Yeah, so we have step and column on our salary schedules, which is about $400,000 for our district each year. On top of that, our additional STRS and PERS costs, because those rates are going up, that's about another $600,000. So just right out of the gate, before we get a penny from the state more, we have to come up with about $1 million per step and column, and the pension plan increases for STRS and PERS.
Just so people are aware, I probably take at least half the people that work that are staff and he worked over something, so he's not going to unless you know what some of us are far outside of the huge majority of these people wouldn't. But that has to be also that a lot of us are actually
So to follow up on that question, Tim, so California Price Index, when it came out in January, it was 3%. So is that more along the lines of what it's costing us, like this 2.15 is the national average, but the CPI for this area was 3. And so are we more in that neighborhood, or?
In regards to, are we more in that neighborhood in regards to what? I don't
To the costs and that. So if they're saying here that the national average is 2.15 in automatic increases, then the California local average was 3% this year. And so is that a better estimate for where we are?
You know, we probably would have to look at, you know, the specifics of our costs in our budget, because, you know, we're service oriented with staffing. So, you know, 85 to 90% of our budget is salary and benefits. The other big chunks, you know, utilities are the next probably biggest expenditure, along with some property and liability type insurances. So we could look at the specific cost increases in those areas. And then the other, you know, program that does experience increased costs is special education. So we can look at the costs associated with operating those programs is good. So I don't have kind of a 1% fits all.
Just to clarify, Robert, what the state that inflator the state gives us, is that a pool of money for us to use outside our normal expenditures, or is that just meant to cover the normal incremental step and column? And
Yeah, so what that's going to do, to get into the LCF set in particular, the LCFF has a target, and then it has the funding that we actually get to move toward the target. So when we say that the cost of living adjustment is 2.15%, that means the target is going to move up 2.15% from the prior year. The amount of money that the Department of Finance is saying now that they think they'll be able to provide is $1.9 billion. So the actual dollars will go up by $1.9 billion. Now, in a sense, a big part of that increase, the $1.9 billion, is simply inflationary costs that every district will face. And what happens is, you know, the formulas will work out, you know, your base grant funding by 4 grade spans, your unduplicated pupil percentage, I don't know if you're 25, 30% range, you get some extra money in supplemental grant. And so those are the overall dollars that the state will provide to Benicia unrestricted, and they'll say that the supplemental grant is targeted for increased and improved services to those students, but the overall structure of it is it's an unrestricted dollar sum targeted for higher levels of service. But within that, then you will have to pay your $400,000 for step and column and so forth that Tim mentions. So they're not giving it to each district item by item. They're just giving the total dollar amount and saying within that, you have to meet all of your costs.
And the 2% plus inflator, that's not allocated 2% to every district. I'm hearing you say it's allocated based upon the LCFF formula. So some schools might get 3.5%. We might get 1.2%.
That is right. So 5 years ago when we were under so-called revenue limits, a different funding system, we pretty much, everyone got 3% if it was a 3% COLA or 4%, I mean, within, some math. But now the differences could be significantly different under the LCFF because of that unduplicated pupil percentage. So, when we speak about averages, we always want to kind of caveat that because, we've got districts that are 10% unduplicated and we've got districts that are 100%. And, in the very same year, they're getting the dollar out of the very same budget, but their year-to-year growth is going to be significantly different. I mean,
we're at
very,
22%.
22, yeah. So you're well below the statewide average. So these next series of slides are not specifically revenue slides and budget slides, but they will be pertinent because I think this issue will not go away, and it's kind of coming up largely in big districts, but a lot of districts hear this discussion. So the issue here is how are school districts spending their LCFF dollar? Because I had mentioned earlier, when Governor Brown put this together, he provided money for base grants, and then he provided money to assist the kind of traditionally underserved or underperforming students who are now being, generating extra money under the supplemental and concentration grant. So your low income, your English learners and foster youth. So the legislature or some members of the legislature decided that, well, let's audit school districts to see how they are spending their money. And are they in fact spending that supplemental and concentrate dollar to increase and improve services to the targeted students at the school site level? And so 3 big school districts were sent letters by the chairman of the Joint Legislative Audit Committee that they were going to be audited so long as the committee agreed with the chair's request for this audit, and that they would be looking at spending at the district down to the school site level. And in LA Unified, as you can imagine, there's a lot of schools there. So this caused a lot of anxiety on the part of the school districts and a part of the education community more broadly, because budgets are not set up to provide that type of information. It's just not budgeted that way, and it's not tracked that way by expenditure category. So this was a kind of an expectation that because the request came from the chair of the audit committee, that this would be approved by the committee itself. But statewide organizations came together to resist this audit. And this is one of these rare occasions where the CTA and the Federation of Teachers were on the same letterhead as the school boards and AXA and CASBO and CSESA and so forth, all saying that this audit was inappropriate given the local control that districts are granted under the LCFF, given how budgets are developed, given how the state account code structures have been developed, that the specifics of the audit letter could not be addressed by what is in place in these school districts right now. So they laid out kind of a rigorous argument against the proposed audit, and I think it was very significant that both labor and management were on that same letter. That very day the chair withdrew his request. So he kind of backed off of it. He indicated, however, that the issue was not over, that he may revisit this issue, but I think it is the tension that school districts are facing, no matter if you're a large district or 4,500 students. Everyone is in this same gray area because the governor has said, well, I am providing extra money through supplemental and concentration grants, depending on your unduplicated pupil percentage, so that you can increase and improve your services to these students. And at the same time, you can spend these monies according to your local priorities as you describe them in your LCAP. And that all of these monies, unlike the past when we had 40 plus categorical programs, are not categorical and they are not restricted. And so every district is now facing this situation where, on the one hand, you have supplemental and concentration grant dollars, and you have 8 state priorities, and you are expected to increase and improve these services and ultimately close the achievement gap. And then on the other, these are unrestricted dollars, and if your community, through all of your input sessions, says, here's how we would like to spend these dollars, and we think this is the best way to serve our students, including the targeted students, you have the latitude to do that. So what you end up seeing is the lawsuits about alleged misuse of LCFF funds are now targeted at the local school district level. And so you don't have the focus of school finance at the state level, you have it now at the local level on how districts are spending their money. And there are, it's a gray area. I think everyone would admit to it. And I think in some sense, this is the genius of the governor. Because what the governor has done is said, if you have an issue, take it to your local school board. Take it to your community. Because this is where the decisions are made. We at Sacramento are no longer making these decisions. Now, the audit, I think, could fuel the other side of the argument, which is because we don't have budgets and account codes that allow us to answer all of these questions down to the school site level, we need to change the law. And we need to reintroduce much more restrictions on how dollars are spent. So it's going to be this push and pull about local control and flexibility versus statutory requirements for accountability and transparency. So, it'll come up again, and just by the fact that you saw LA Unified, the biggest district in the state, it's going to have the biggest representation in the legislature being targeted for this audit. That tells you that it's, there are some that want to dig into this issue. Now, I think Governor Brown, he has been very clear. He's been, defending local flexibility all the way. The administration, they did not want to even issue, have the Department of Education issue account codes that would, show, other than the general fund account, where these monies were being spent. So they resisted that. So in the end, you'll be faced with this kind of tension. I think it's just built into the system. The other issue here that gets a lot of attention in Sacramento and now is literally sitting on the governor's desk is the cap on school district reserves. So several years ago, the legislature and the governor enacted legislation with the trailer bill that set a cap on school district reserves equal to twice the required minimum. And so for Benicia, that'd be twice 3% minimum, so 6% maximum cap on district reserves in your district. Now, before the cap is triggered, there has to be certain conditions that are met at the state level, some of them tied to Proposition 98, and it's kind of unclear when all those conditions will line up because it's kind of a year-to-year calculation. But the kind of the big challenge is you don't know when the conditions will line up, and once they do, then the very next year, this cap on district reserves would be imposed, and for most districts, it'd be a 6% cap. So this legislation is now sitting on the governor's desk to make changes in the statutes on the district reserve caps. Right off, it exempts small districts. You're not going to be defined as small, 2,500 ADA or less, and also exempting basic aid school districts. So just those two criteria exempts a lot of school districts in the state. We've got over 1,000 school districts. But you don't have many ADA in those districts. Most of the districts are larger, and so even though it exempts about 600 school districts, all of the ADA shows up in the remaining 400 districts. The other issue that is that it raises the cap from twice the minimum to 10% for all districts. And it changes the conditions under which that cap is imposed. So essentially, it makes it less likely that it will be imposed, but we should be able to see it coming a little bit better, because what it says is if you meet all these conditions, and the key condition is a contribution to the state's Proposition 98 reserve. It used to be a dollar is contributed into that reserve. The very next year, the caps are imposed. Now, the contribution has to reach 3% of Prop 98 spending. That's roughly $2 billion. So we would be watching to see, well, have we contributed 500 million? Have we contributed $1 billion? Have we contributed, $2 billion? And once we reach that 3% level, again, which is about $2 billion, then we would know the next year the cap's imposed. So it gives a little bit of a warning about that. So the bill was agreed to and negotiated between CSBA and CTA, and the original cap was CTA's initiative, and it really had no, it was one of the trailer bill deals a couple of years back. So the fact that CTA has signed on to this compromise suggests to most of us that the governor will likely sign it. And so he's got about 3 more weeks to work on bills. And this is one of them. So I'd say it's likely that it gets signed. So that's kind of my comments on the kind of the big kind of key issues right now in Sacramento, revenues and the audit and this reserve cap bill. What I have next are some comparisons of your district and the same comparison districts that we had in our packet the last several years. So we're kind of generally consistent. I think we added Napa this year. That's the one new addition. But otherwise, they're all the same districts. So you can see them, and if you happen to pull up last year's, it's going to look like that list, I think, with Napa as the only addition. So yeah, and I think we have Davis in there. I think we put Davis in for one reason or another. Yeah. So this chart is kind of showing the factors that generally drive your unduplicated pupil percentage. And so you can see in the that first column of numbers there, Benicia is 21% free and reduced price meals, and 3% English learners. So your unduplicated pupil percentage is going to be significantly lower than your comparison group. So 22%, 25%, you're going to be well below Vallejo, West Contra Costa, Woodland, and so forth. Those districts will get more money because they have more of the targeted students. I think last year, Benicia was probably 15th on this list. It's 14th now. Positions don't change all that much, as you might imagine.
I think, Robert, it's interesting to see the English learner column, the percentage. So in this comparable group of 17, Benicia is the lowest percentage at 3.25% of our students are English learners compared to those other folks there. So that's just something to recognize. The other districts have a higher English learner population.
This is 15-16 data. It's the most recent data that we have certified at statewide level, 15-16. Yes, everything's 15-16 on these comparisons. So this is a net ending balance. I believe you were 9th last year, moved up 1 position. So this is net ending balance on a per ADA basis, kind of trying to have it comparable to the districts with more ADA. And so Benicia is kind of right in the middle of the comparison group pack there, $1,332 per ADA net ending balance.
Excuse me, Robert, can you explain what the net ending balance is?
Yeah, so kind of in a broad picture, you have revenues coming into the district, you have expenditures that the district will incur, you have from the prior year a net ending balance. So it's whatever was left over from last year comes in on the top as a revenue source. So then you go whatever comes in from last year's net ending balance plus the revenues, subtract out the expenditures, and then you have a net ending balance now for this year. And then that little residual, hopefully it's positive, goes over to the other. Now, if you have a big reserve, then you might be deficit spending to keep from keep your expenditure level as it is. But it's essentially the subtraction of the revenues, expenditures. You have a little bit of leftover revenues. That's your ending balance.
In terms of apples to apples comparisons, as we're trying to figure out where we might rank and how we make budgeting decisions, the criteria we should use, is it that we should find schools that are districts that are in that same net ending balance per ADA? I mean, it looks like on that chart, Mount Diablo is receiving $1,500 more than we are, and well, it's probably as an apples to orange like comparison. I mean, on the one hand, you want to, emotionally say, well, what's the similar neighborhoods or communities to Benicia aspires to be? And when you look at that, you realize, well, the funding is really different, even between us and areas that would surprise me, like Nevada. But so, is it really that we should be looking at that band of school districts that are, Travis, Davis, Benicia, Vacaville, maybe Martinez, that are in that same, have that same?
Yeah,
because they're going to make comparable decisions, aren't they? With their same funding.
So I think this number is. I think what you should do is kind of look at a lot of comparisons, because there's not going to be one and one only that will be your guide. You're going to want to look at a lot of these things. So in this case, a district's net ending balance could be positive or negative for one-time events that have occurred in their district that didn't occur into yours. So if they had a one-time expense that they had to fix a roof, or they had something unexpected, maybe their net ending balance is low, so the per ADA number is they're down at the bottom of the list. Something on the positive side, maybe they had some benefactor provide money, or they had unexpected number of teachers retire, and so you hired in teachers at the beginning end of the salary schedule, so you had some savings there that you hadn't expected. So they can move around a lot. I guess what I would say is you're kind of in your general neighborhood of the others with this level on a per ADA basis, but kind of getting down to what reasons why I think could be kind of the key thing when you build your budget in particulars.
What I struggle with is under the LCFF formula, since it is not categorical and it's not audited, that districts that get those funds will be able to pay higher compensation and benefits and attract teachers that may be neighboring us, because they're just getting money from the state on an unequal basis without having to justify how they're using it.
Well, so I think that's the counter argument, though, or the argument that counters that is you are getting these extra monies because you have more students who are low income. You have more students who are English learners. And while you might make an argument that paying all of your teachers more money makes them better teachers and they're going to close the achievement gap, others are going to say, well, you should be providing these students with a longer school day, or a longer school year, or aides in the class, or more instructional materials. So the intent, again, without the requirement, is that you're increasing and improving services to these students so that achievement gap closes.
There's no accountability or measurement of whether or not that's actually occurring.
And so I think that that's exactly right. So we are in a kind of a new situation where our accountability system and our testing system, the dashboard's new. So all of these metrics are kind of just getting established to see, well, is this actually working? And, in some school districts, they actually have distinguished between, the length of the school day in these targeted schools and the length of the school day over here. And so the teachers over here actually make more money because they work longer hours and more days than these schools over here. So, depending on, the district that you're looking at, they have taken different approaches to how they use that supplemental and concentration grant dollar. So I think, there's always this tension between compensation for all and targeted, services per the spirit of the LCFF.
Because in most school districts, the ratios of what the expenses to run a district will be is in compensation, right? It's going to be the 75, 85%, no matter what district you're in.
Yeah,
So-
it's a large piece of it. There's no way around it. Even higher.
So, I'm just putting that in balance. Isn't that based on what's in the reserve that's left over?
It's what
That's not what we're bringing in, that's just what we have left over.
what's left over, correct?
That has nothing to do with that. It has to do with what we have.
Well,
So,
it does, right? Because
Yeah.
if you have left, if you're
Yeah,
getting lots left over, it's because you've got more income.
right, but it's also how you spend it. And I know this big thing about salary, you have your priorities. And when we have departments here that are larger than they've been that we've grown in the last 5 years, larger than they were 10 years ago, that maybe we don't need.
Like what?
The curriculum department has more employees than it had years ago. We're going to trainings and workshops, district office administrators and teachers. If we don't have the funding, we should not be sending people all over. We just shouldn't. I look at the budget and we overspent.
On
I don't know where my question actually is, well, I know we were way off on STIRS. We were way off. I don't understand how the budget and the actuals were so far off. We're talking, I think it was 1.7 million off. That's huge. And then we have, I don't know where in here, I can't find in all this document that I've looked at, I cannot find where trainings and workshops are, but I know we are spending thousands upon thousands of dollars sending people to workshops. We're not doing the right thing. Those are extras. Those are fluff. If we have people here in-house doing trainings and helping out with workshops, so we don't need to send people elsewhere and spend money we don't have. We should not be deficit spending. And I'm thinking we are kind of going, ooh, look, we have some money and spending it when you've got a few people getting a lot and then a whole group of teachers who are now going to make less. And we need to find money for them so that they can make their payments. And instead of sending people on trips. So I think it's not about do we have money, do we not have money? It's what are our priorities? And there are things we could cut and take out of our budget to make room for things that we really do need.
Okay, so the next is your general fund revenue per student, and this kind of illustrates what that LCFF is all about, unfortunately, for low unduplicated pupil percentages. So Benicia was at the bottom of this list last year. They're at the bottom of this list this year. And again, what drives this is 22% low income and 3-4% English learners. And that's by design. That's what the governor put forward. That's what the legislature enacted. So West Contra Costa is getting $3,000 more, and how they spend it. The expectation is that they are improving and increasing service to those target students so that those students do better. And that is kind of the tension again when I go back to the audit issue. Are they spending it in that way, and how is it being spent when you look at the school site level? So
This is, to me, the crux of the whole problem. I mean, the fact that we get double whammy because we're in the lowest in the list and we're the smallest. So Leo with 13,000 kids is making $3,000 more in revenue, or 2,000 more than in revenue than we are, and then multiply that by 10,000 more students. So the scale of our operations with only 4,000 it costs more to, the ratios are higher. Your overhead per student is going to be higher in a smaller district. And everybody wants that. We'd like to have small elementary schools, and we like that. But the reality of it is you can operate at scale more cost effectively, right? And the states have given you a reward for that by giving you per student $2,500 more student, which is almost a third of our entire budget.
Well, in theory, those students cost more to educate. So, right. I mean,
if they're being true to the LCFF methodology, right. But the anecdotal stories are, right, which I think was prompting the efforts in Sacramento, is there isn't accountability, and the money gets spent through a process of negotiation that isn't always about the students.
Mm-hmm. Yet this is part of the conversation we were having with Tim when we were talking about the disparity with all of the districts in the state of California. I mean, you're going from districts getting $3 million a year more to districts getting $16 million a year more, and further on up as we go to look at each of the districts. And that's a lot of money when you really start looking at each district, because you all got the same base needs. I mean, we all have needs that have to be met. That's pretty consistent. It's just a matter of how big you are. So I think the spirit of the LCFF is really good, and I think it's powerful. What concerns me as we're moving through it is the discrepancy which is occurring, and that's what I think is probably becoming more and more clear that it's not fair.
Right.
So, but Diane, so what you were saying, that if Benicia had Dublin's ADA and you multiplied it by our ADA of about 5,000 students, we'd get $3 million more in yearly revenue at the low end. And then if we took the difference and multiplied West Contra Costa with our students, that would be $16 million more.
Yeah, huge. And then when you think about it, to your point, that the base grant is supposed to be funding your base costs, which would be, your salaries and benefits and PERS and STRS. Well, PERS and STRS rates are rising all the way through 2021 and so forth. And base grants alone are not keeping pace with that cost of STRS and PERS retirement. And so, the challenge for, Tim and his staff is, well, how do you, put your budget together when each and every year that rate escalates? It's not constant, it's escalating, up and up and up. So you start off each year with a squeeze, and if all the state provides is a cost of living adjustment for the average district, and you're below average, mm-hmm. Well, you're not getting a cost of living adjustment, let alone enough to cover the STRS and PERS, which is escalating above that.
And that was a huge conversation at one point when they were imposing the increases every year for STRS and PERS, is how were they going to support districts to make that happen, when in fact those two never got together. So it's like they're still imposing it. We still have to do it, and you want to do it. It's the right thing to do, but still the state has not stepped up on their game to say, okay, we're imposing this new increase and we're going to support districts that way.
Yeah, and I think, it's a little bit of what story does the governor want to tell when he finishes up his final year in office? I think the story that he would like to tell is that he had put in place a new funding system that was simpler and gave more control to local school boards to spend those monies. And over the course of his term, that formula got fully implemented. Now then, of course, everyone in this room would say, well, what that formula fails to recognize is that those targets did not take into consideration STRS and PERS rate increases that were not in place when this got put together. And so that eats up all of that, not every dollar, but it eats up, I think, 25% of that new dollar just to pay for the stirs and purs. And I mean, some of my background is I used to work at the Department of Finance. I was there when some of that legislation got signed to increase benefits. And so benefits got increased when the funds were at 102% funded. And the argument was that no one has to pay more for these higher benefits because the funds themselves are more than 100% funded. Well, that was valuing the fund when the market was the stock market was at an all-time high, given that time. And when the stock market falls off and more retirees come in line, the rates did not go up, so they neglected to raise the rates. You get an unfunded liability of 30, 40, 50 billion dollars. They have no place to go but raising rates.
Is there any indication? I think, Peter, you asked at the last board meeting, but I thought I'd ask you, is there any indication that the investment portfolio for stirs and purs is projected to do better on the horizon?
Yeah, so they do this actuarial study each year and kind of evaluate, well, what's the value of our portfolio today versus the expectation for the future. And they lowered their long-term expectation of rate of return growth on that portfolio, I think from 7.5% to 7%. And then they recompute, longevity of retirees and so forth. What they came out with last summer was a kind of a conclusion that the rates that they have in place now, scheduled to rise, will be sufficient to pay the liability. So they're not saying that they're going to have to raise rates again. They're saying that these should be sufficient. Now they do escalate up to over 20%. But they're not saying they need to go to 30.
What's happening is a lot of the management, a lot of the people that superintendent, all of those categories, and across the state, there was one or two different across the state, get these huge raises right at the end, and they're in third as well. Administrators started out, the teachers are now having huge salaries, and they get these big increases at the end, which has happened in the system. And then what happens is that now, for life, they have a huge retirement tax coming, and that is really burdening. First is all these huge increases in the highest 3 years, no matter what your job is. And so, when they say a lot of the teachers live down here, well, our income isn't that high, so you get people making $400,000 a year, and that's the basis of the time. And so you have to really watch giving these huge increases right at the end of the retirement so that now they're basically really having this. And then I documented that. That's one of the big problems that's happening.
Robert, a question came up at the school board meeting in regards to, is there a goal for stirs and purs to kind of roll back the rates for employers? We talked briefly about that today.
Yeah, so I think, in the STIRS system, the state actually has a contribution as well as the employer and the employee. And so the way the actuarial analysis is now is that those rates will necessarily escalate to 20.15% or whatever it is. And I think the only way that those rates wouldn't continue to escalate, assuming they reach their targets on return on that investment portfolio, is the state would have to step in and take an ever larger share of the unfunded liability. I think that's remote. I mean, they might, but I just don't see them putting more into the retirement than they've already agreed to per the reform statute that raised the rates on employers and employees, because the market could escalate. It could take pressure off of maybe the last year of rates, but that'd be maybe wishing for too much, because they said, well, 7.5% rate of return for the long term seems too high. They knocked it down only to 7. Now, I think a lot of us would say, well, can I get a guaranteed 7% rate of return on my portfolio? I'd love to have that. But that is what STRS and PERS assumes, 7%. If it turns out over the long run to be 6, there's a hole. So, the benefits were granted at the peak. When the peak fell off, no one did anything about it. And in the case of STRS, it needs to be a bill passed by the legislature, signed by the governor to raise the rates. That just never happened. And so everyone could see the unfunded liability getting, bigger and bigger and bigger, but no one did anything about it. Governor Brown, I think to his credit, stepped up and led that rate increase, employer, employee, and the state. All 3 legs of the stool paying more.
CalSTRS website talks about the preventing pension spiking, and actually talks about AB 340 putting a cap on large increases. And so they've addressed that.
Right.
No, it was passed in the past. And then they conduct audits at school districts with unusual. Yeah, it looks like that would be capped now.
That's
Right. And I actually think it's capped to STRS now.
STRS won't do it.
STRS won't take it on. They've passed regulation too, which they should.
2015, they passed regulations.
So this is another measure, kind of a little bit of what we saw, but it's the restricted in the center column and the unrestricted in the center column, and the restricted funds again on the right-hand column, and Benicia again at the bottom, and that's where you were last year as well. Again, just an indication, low revenues, both restricted and unrestricted for your district.
You wouldn't have maybe you'll get to it later. Not prior slide. I'm just looking at, there's a way to measure total revenue of districts, including in the state, parcel taxes, foundations. Is there a spreadsheet that we could look at that, like all sources of revenue?
I'd have to go back and kind of query the folks who run our database about whether we compile it by all
parcel
of
taxes.
That. I would think that we could get something like that.
Like I know Nevada has a parcel tax.
Yeah,
We have
I've
partial
got a
tax.
slide in the back that
Yeah.
has some of that information.
Yeah, but what do you see?
I'm just wondering, it would be interesting to see.
And I would assume, Robert, that if one of these comparable districts does have a parcel tax, I believe the parcel tax would be listed as unrestricted revenues. Unrestricted. So one of the reasons, if these other districts do have a parcel tax, is one of the reasons why they're have a higher revenue flow is because of that parcel tax. And we'll see a few of those in the, you'll see the list at the end of the presentation.
So can I ask one more clarifying question before we jump? On the previous slide where we have Benicia as number 17 for ADA at 9,700, on the next line you break it out. So most of the extra $1,200 is really for our unduplicated students? And then when we add it together to our base of 85 is where we get the 97, correct?
Well, I think some of these restricted dollars also could be federal restricted dollars.
Okay, but I guess the point I'm trying to, or the clarity I'm trying to get to for me is we're not getting $9,700 per student. We're getting 85, and for the other 21%, we're getting 97, or approximately, right? Isn't that?
So you're in the unrestricted column. Yes. That will be all of your LCFF money, including the supplemental grant portion.
Okay.
So it will show up as unrestricted, and legally it is unrestricted. Even though they say it's for targeted students, it is unrestricted dollars.
Right, but if I take that $9,700 and I go times 5,000 kids, that's not really accurate for the money we're getting in our district, because really, the majority of our kids, since we only have 22%, really, we use 85 and then take that, use that 8,500, and then to that we add however many unduplicated students we have at 97, because they're generating the more money.
I
Am I
think I
making
follow
sense?
you.
Somebody get it?
And we,
I s-
I think that is, I don't think it's separate out.
Well, but we don't get
You're right,
the
but
extra
that's for everybody. We're gonna get that total, right?
8,500 for everybody.
No, but don't we really get the 97?
No. We don't get the 9,700, I know.
so Robert, within that, within the unrestricted column, the 8,500, that includes our LCFF funds.
Yes.
So that includes everything we get from LCFF, including the base and the supplemental. There's a few other unrestricted funding sources in there too. There's an unrestricted lottery piece.
Mhm.
There's a restricted lottery piece for, and then there's also an unrestricted. So that small couple $100 per kid for lottery would be in that 8,500. But the majority of that $8,500 number would be the LCFF funds.
So then what's the 1,200?
The 1,200 is like a restricted lottery is in there. All of our federal programs, special education funding from the SELPA, donations, Medi-Cal, and full.
I think Diane's question, though, is we're not really able to spend $9,700 per child because these restriction funds are dedicated to very specific things.
It
They
might
really
be-
can only spend $8,540 per child.
Right.
And so then only 22% of our kids, or 21, whatever, is getting additional 1257.
No,
No.
no, they're not all getting 1257
No.
because that money is required to go to specific things.
And that's
So a
federal.
chunk of it goes to special ed.
Right,
kind
but
of
some of
thing.
those specific things, from what I've seen in here, so let's say you have a special ed teacher. Part of her income may come from the restricted, and part of the rest of it come from unrestricted. So it's not like they don't spend it all, they're not using it at all, it's just you use some of it. That's my understanding, that some of that, some of the unrestricted is still used for our general fund, it's just you can't use it for me because I'm not a special ed teacher, you can use it for whatever.
That would be like
Contribution.
So it's not like we're using it on something totally separate, we're using it within the budget. Just to add it to the budget, right, you need to have. No, I got that, I was just.
Yeah, I think the reason it's a little confusing is that this is just basically saying, let's take all the revenue sources that are unrestricted, let's take all the revenue sources that are restricted, divide those two pots of money by the 4,500 ADA that you have. So that's just a measure of revenues only. To really get, I think, at the particulars of your question, then is, okay, well, how are we spending our monies? Because some of those monies have to be spent on certain things on that right-hand column restricted. So some of them, we have to spend it on, routine restricted maintenance, or we have to spend it on, textbooks from the lottery specifically restricted. Others, we could spend it on whatever. So it's a little bit hard to make a generalization that you have this much money to spend on the students over on the middle column and this much money to spend on the students on the restricted column, because some of those you could argue, well, it's all generally for the students, but your school site administration, your district-wide administration, your transportation program, I don't know if you have one, your maintenance and everything else. So I think to get more at your question, it's a little bit more if we denominated your expenditure side, if you want to do it on a per pupil, be more helpful maybe, because all this is just taking pots of money and dividing. So this is, probably not a real valuable chart. It's just, if you're using a special reserve fund for your unspent balances, you might have dollars in here, and you could see half of the districts in your comparison group don't use the special reserve fund. That doesn't mean they have no reserve. They're just not using this designated reserve for some other purpose. So I wouldn't draw too many conclusions that you have nothing in the special reserve fund. So let's say you needed to set it aside because you were going to, buy a bus next year or something like that. You're setting it aside for some particular purpose. Yeah.
One of the things I'm going to talk to our auditors about when they come back in October is right now we've been directed to have the stadium replacement fund. So in 10 or 15 years, what's needed for that. So right now, who's going to talk to our auditors if this could be an option and bring that back to the school board.
Or just deferred maintenance in general so that we're not having to pass a bond every 10 years.
So these are other comparisons that kind of move from the revenue side to how the district is spending its money. So, as we kind of have shown, the district really is on the low end of receiving revenues. And your class size is not the highest, but your K-3 class, 25 to 1, is on the higher end of the spectrum here. And in some sense, in order to run your district with significantly less than average money, you have to do something about that. And so you will see some of these class sizes you might, as a general policy, want to have a lower class be down there with Pleasanton and Novato. But in order to get a lower class size, you're going to have to find other places in your budget because the revenue side is not sufficiently generous to get you there. So, you're again in the top quarter or so, but not surprising. For administrators at the school site level, about in the middle, 8 out of 16 here, so 412 students per school site administrator. District level, pretty much in the same ranking position among your comparison group. These are class sizes now by specific grade level for your district compared to the average of that comparison group. And so you can see that you're a little bit higher than the average of the comparison group. And again, because your revenues are significantly lower. That's how your budget is able to, fit, essentially.
So, according to LCSF, we're supposed, and I know that there's a large discussion with that. At some point, our target is 24 to 1. Right. Is that correct in LCFF?
Yes, 24 to 1.
And what is the time frame for that?
Pardon me?
What is the time frame for that?
So the time frame is linked to what we call full implementation of the overall LCFF.
So that should be 18-19.
So the governor has targeted 2021. When you kind of look at the pace of implementation, we are running ahead of schedule, I would say. Okay. And so we could be at full implementation depending on kind of the economy and how much money we end up getting under Proposition 98. I mean, we could get there in 1920, maybe a year ahead of schedule. And so that then would say 24 to 1 for all districts should be in that same year. Now, this is 15-16 data. I'm looking at K through 3, and you're right about 24 and a half. The grade 3 is a little bit higher, but so if you made a little bit of progress in 16, 17, you could be close to there now. I don't know the exact numbers, but you could be pretty close to there already. This is middle school by subject matter area. Again, the district average, the district compared to the comparison group average. A little bit smaller class size in English, a little bit larger class size in language. So, you know, it's a little bit of up and down, I guess. You know, I don't know how districts compile this. This is, you know, this is reported by your district. It's just compiled in a big database. I can't tell you any more than what's on this chart, unfortunately. I can't tell you how it's compiled or what it includes. It's as accurate as it's been reported by your district, I guess. I don't want to blame anybody, but, you know, we just have a big database in the sky and pull this down.
Well, this is 7th and 8th. This isn't 6th grade.
This is middle school by these program areas.
What's that?
Sixth grade is reported on the elementary side.
But also, this is usually based on CalPADS reports, which is run through PowerSchool. So there is really no way, it just directly their reports get uploaded from PowerSchool. This is also average. So one class may be, in this case, Carolyn, your class may be like 29, 30 kids, but there may be other classes. But resource class usually, again, I can't speak to 15, 16. Typically, they wouldn't have their own classes. SDC, it gets reported separately. Yeah. Usually, I'm just sharing the usual reporting system for CBED's report, because all of this comes from CBED's reports, which is reported in October of every year.
And if you look at sixth grade, those classes are averaging 31, 32. And that sounds more like what you're reflecting.
Okay, and these are, again, high school, similar by subject matter area. And so I'd say, you know, you're generally, you know, close to the averages, but, you know, some a little above, some a little bit below. So those are the slides we had on comparison. Again, kind of revenue side discussion and the kind of how your classes largely are loaded.
So just to sum it up, it looks like we're doing more with less.
Yes.
Is there anywhere we're an outlier where you saw like, wow, that looked unusual for your revenues?
No, and I should have said that, because I do agree with you, because, you know, it's not like you're in the bottom quarter of revenues. You are at the very bottom. I mean, you are at the bottom. And if you look at your class sizes, you are not at the very highest level of class size. So you are able to get your class sizes a little bit lower than your revenues would suggest. So, you know, I think you do deserve some credit for that, because, you know, districts only have as much money as they, you know, can spend, and they're expected to, you know, educate their students. You know, there's demands on the budget all the way across, and not just in the classroom. I mean, you know, there are things like insurance and, you know, again, keeping the roof from leaking and all kinds of other things that you're going to have to spend money on. So I think you are doing a lot more with not less, the least, at least among these folks. Okay, so I was asked to put together just a little discussion on a reserve policy, because this is kind of a challenge that, you know, there's no kind of hard and fast number that, you know, is the right number for a reserve. So I think, you know, it's always good to just remind ourselves, you know, there's no such thing as a good budget without a reserve, and you want to make sure that you control. Sorry, I'm kind of losing my voice. You know, you control your district's fate by having a reserve, because you don't want to turn your district's fate over to, you know, the county office for a loan, or ultimately the state for a loan. And, you know, districts that really get into trouble, you know, they get a state administrator, the board loses its power, and so forth. So that reserve is your buffer to keep governance in place locally. Now, people ask about that cap on district reserves. Thank you. And what we say is it's not triggered. Don't lower your reserve because that 10% or 6% cap might be imposed in the future. You need to keep this reserve in place because when things got bad under the Great Recession, no one expected things to get as bad as they did. No one expected 10% cuts to the revenue limits, 20% cut to categoricals, and not just for a year. That just was one year after another. Those cuts stayed in place. So, the reserve is there to help you manage your program and not end up insolvent and having a state administrator come in and say, okay, now I get to make all the decisions on how to spend money here. So,
out of curiosity, when the state does take over a district like Vallejo, are they paying, the money that the state's allocating them now? Are they paying some of that back to the
yes.
state? So the numbers we see might reflect.
So what they will have is they will get a state loan because we're not going to close a school. I mean, kids are going to have to be educated, and so if a district gets into fiscal trouble, the state is going to issue a loan and provide them more than their LCFF would say they're entitled to in that year and see them through their crisis. But that loan does have to be repaid. And so a repayment schedule is worked out, 5-year, 10-year, 20-year repayment schedule. They do have to pay that back. So just some thinking about a reserve, and this probably goes without saying, but reserves in general, you have your historical past practice, your community priorities, your risk tolerance of the board for getting close to the line or having a sizable cushion. Those are all legitimate factors that govern the reserve. Now, to think of it more specifically, I've listed a few things here to say, well, how do we guide our thinking? So if you're a small district, you need a larger reserve as a percentage of your budget. Because in a small district, one unplanned event could wipe your reserve out. So one, boiler that needs replacement could take your reserve down to zero. You need to maintain a larger reserve as a small district than a district like LA Unified, and the state's criterion and standards actually reflects that. The very small districts need a 5% reserve. LA Unified, 1% is what they have in criterion standards. State aid districts, for the most part, you're getting your money based on your enrollment. But if you're a declining enrollment district, you're essentially losing money year over year because you don't have as many students as you had last year. So in that case, you need to pay attention because growing districts, a lot of times you get new money each year. You kind of have an ability to kind of manage because next year I'm going to have 5% more or 6% more. But in a declining district, and you look to the future, right off you're going to have less than this year. And what if something happens on top of the enrollment decline? So state-funded LCF districts really do need to pay attention to enrollment, and in a declining district, you should have a larger reserve. Now, basic aid districts, that's not here, but a basic aid district is funded from the property tax. Now, people at one level think, well, you're a basic aid district, you have no problems. But a basic aid district, their revenues don't follow their enrollment at all. It just follows the property tax. And so if your enrollment's growing and your property values are flat, you've got a problem, you've got a challenge. So basic aid districts are looking essentially at assessed valuations and property tax revenues relative to their enrollments. Federal lands, they need to pay attention to federal policy because federal government provides federal impact aid. And I know of districts that get into trouble because they don't calculate correctly how much they're getting in federal money, and then the next thing you know, they've overspent their budget because the federal formulas are complicated. And then, another issue, because this will be discussed here, parcel taxes, let's say. Some districts, they enjoy a parcel tax, or they enjoy multiple parcel taxes. So those bring new dollars into the district, but they also come with challenges, because some parcel taxes are good for 5 years and then they expire. If they happen to expire in a recession, the chances of renewal go down. People don't feel as flush, and so your chances of renewing that parcel tax might go down. So you're kind of paying attention to the term of those taxes. Sometimes they have no escalator at all. They just bring in a fixed dollar amount, and your enrollment's growing, but this source of your revenue is flat. It actually creates a challenge because you've got a source of revenue that's actually not keeping pace with enrollment. So these are things to watch on revenue volatility. I talked about enrollment trends. And then these are other issues at the very bottom. If you happen to have, litigation that you're facing, or startup costs, you're going to, be adding a school site or some portables, and you need to equip them, debt obligations, and so forth. So
I'm sorry, is it correct that we are a declining enrollment district, correct? So the fact that we're last on the chart and our enrollment is declining is also impacting our problem. It's compounding the issue.
So these are just some various guidelines on reserves. 2 months of general operating expenses, 17% of general fund expenditures. That comes from one of the federal accounting standards boards. It's just kind of and it's not unique to schools. It's, I think, unique. It's a general observation for all public agencies. So they say a 17% reserve is sufficient, or you should aim for that. If you look at the criterion standards that the Department of Education has developed, and here's where it shows the size of the district. The larger the size, the smaller the percentage reserve that you need. So again, a very small district of 0 to 380A, we want a 5% reserve. You go down to LA Unified, over 400,000 students. That's only LA Unified, 1% reserve. So most districts are falling right in that middle, 3%, 1,000 to 30,000 ADA. And I pulled up the actual reserve levels for 15-16. And so you can see they're all well above the minimum. And there is some pressure to, well, you should cut your reserve. Well, our view is you don't need to cut your reserve, and you don't need to continuously build it. But if you cut it and then we have a turnaround, then where are you? You brought your cushion down when if you just maintained it, you don't have to put any more money into it. You can just maintain your reserve. So again, nothing magical about these numbers, but I'm hoping that the prior slide gives you some sense of way to think about, well, where are your risks, and is your current reserve sufficient, or do you want to build another one?
Maybe this is an obvious point to everybody, but that average is for us a unified school district. That's not in the comparison group. That's in California.
Yes, yeah, that's California in
so
total.
Some
all
can be
districts.
way above that, and some below
Yes.
that.
And we are at about 7%, the 3% required, and the 4% board.
Yes, we have the 3% state minimum
Mm-hmm.
required. We have the local board policy. facility program and those reserves, a big piece for our state. So over the last couple of years, we decided that we didn't and couldn't spend all of those in one single year. So we have a 3-year plan to help us spend down those funds. So when we closed the books in June, that was $3.7 million. But again, a large portion of that is for our state one-time grant. So you can there's a 3% reserve. The 4% reserve is about $2 million, and so the other reserve would probably be another less than 4%.
Between 10 and 11. Between 10 and 11.
The way that Tim described it is with its the way that is reflected similarly in those all of
Okay, so we were asked to take a little bit of a look at parcel taxes and foundation funds here. I talked a little bit, well, go to foundations here. So foundations.
I'm sorry, I'm just processing the information. So we're at 7% reserve because the other 4% would be restricted. And so you had that table before, restricted reserves or special reserves. If we had a disaster or something, we couldn't spend that restricted reserve.
There might be opportunities within each restricted reserve that you could apply it towards certain things.
You'd have to.
Yeah, you'd have to.
Price.
Each
the only unrestricted reserve is the 3% mandated and the 4%.
Correct. 7%.
Unrestricted.
Yes.
And if we did special things like trying to pay down deferred maintenance.
So
things, that would
yeah, and I will say, you know, that $3.7 million. So the state one-time grant, that is technically unrestricted, but it is part of that number. So that piece, we say it's restricted, but that piece is designated for the one-time grant. But that is officially unrestricted.
Why do we have it in a restricted fund? Because it's already dedicated to something?
Yeah, because we brought forth the state one-time grant proposal, which generally has a plan to spend those funds over a 3-year period versus one. If we were to spend it all, it wouldn't be there. So between books and materials, some technology, and some of the other things, to spread that out. It might even be spread out over 4 years, depending on if we are able to even meet the spending requirements for that budget year.
So there's specific spending requirements for those funds?
For those funds, the district has a plan, so we were required to put a plan together, but we can make changes to those.
Before you move on to the revenue side, does the state publish data? I saw, I was just looking at a Sacramento Bee article where they looked at the districts in their area. And they had data that showed teacher pay per student and administrator pay per student, and then the percentage of changes. That's data that they've gotten from the state. Is that something that the state publishes?
Yeah, so there's, I think, Ed Data out there in the website that is accessible by anybody. I'm not sure where Sacramento Bee got it or any of the newsfeeds. But
forward that article to Tim. It would be helpful, I think, for that comparator group if we could see teacher pay per student and administrator pay per student and look at the percentage changes in salaries. Mm-hmm.
All right, so let me make sure I am where I'm supposed to be here. So foundation funds, we were asked to take a look at foundation funds, and I guess I will acknowledge that the data we pulled up on this was really probably not very definitive and more misleading than anything else, and decided that it's not capturing really what foundations do, because foundations are not necessarily running their dollars through the district. I mean, the district can report foundation money into Fund 73, but it doesn't have to report monies into Fund 73. Foundations can purchase items on behalf of the district and simply donate the item itself. And so it's not going to show up as a budget number reported to the state. So you really couldn't gather very much from the state database when you looked at that number. But I just point out that, you know, foundations are very good to have, and they do help you buy one-time items. But sometimes foundations also want to support, you know, particular staff within the district, and they'll say, okay, well, our foundation is supporting, you know, 3 aides or what have you. The challenge there, though, is that those foundation dollars are not going to be necessarily reliable from year to year. And so the generosity of your community is going to be a function of their own particular financial situation. And during good times, you know, people have money to support foundations, a lot of charitable causes. During bad times, those very same people could lose their jobs, and then they can't support the foundation. And so to the extent that foundations are supporting some of your ongoing staff, it creates, I'm not saying you, but districts, it's going to create stressors that you want to be very vigilant of when you utilize foundation money to support your district. Parcel taxes are another source of supplemental revenue to the school district. And parcel taxes need to be adopted by 2/3 of the voters within your school district here. They provide additional revenue to the district. And depending on how they're structured, you know, sometimes they are evergreen taxes. I mean, they voted in forever. Other times they can't get that through, so it's a limited term. It's a 4-year parcel tax. Sometimes the taxes are just based on X dollars per parcel. And so you have 100 parcels, you get, $1 per parcel, you got $100. But if your enrollment were increasing, that $100 is flat. If your if your enrollment's declining, then $100 being flat is not as much of a challenge. But we've certainly seen districts where the parcel tax, of course, it's nice to have, but it doesn't grow. And if it doesn't grow, that becomes a challenge, because if your enrollment's growing, you kind of look at your total revenue saying, well, we have this nice parcel tax, but it's not keeping pace. So depending on how it's spent, that could cause a challenge. So we want to just point out, that evergreen versus expiration, and then the growth. So some tie them to a cost of living adjustment or California CPI, so it has a little bit of an escalator clause in there. So these are parcel taxes that are in place in kind of your general Contra Costa County, and we have Davis in there in Yolo County. But they vary on the dollar amount per parcel. They vary on whether they have an expiration date or they have a particular term. So you can see some of your neighbors and what they've done and when they enacted the tax.
So I have a question about that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just curious if there's any in Solano County.
I didn't even pull that up. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
The last time we asked, there are no school parcel taxes in Solano County.
So, and my other question on the parcel tax is, I know some folks from these counties, and I think it's misleading the way we're looking at it right now, because actually those parcel taxes are designated for specific things. It's not just money from each parcel of land that gets dumped into the general fund.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, and so in some cases, they have unrestricted. In some cases, they can't get the voters to approve an unrestricted parcel tax. So they specifically say, well, with these dollars, we are going to do these things.
Right.
So that you're right, it sets up a more of a convincing argument that the dollars will be spent wisely, and the public can say, okay, well, we agree with this purpose, and so, okay, we're willing to spend that tax or to tax ourselves for that purpose.
Which in essence would free up money in the general fund. But I mean, they are not past I've been talking to some folks too. It's like the parcel taxes have been passed. They've had a mission.
Yeah.
So to speak.
And whether they free up monies or whether they supplement the program, I think is, kind of going to be a kind of, how do you best frame it? Because I think in some sense, if it frees up monies, then it's just substituting for something else that the district does versus, well, we are going to do something above and beyond, which we could not have done with our funding from the state. Yeah, and I'm sorry. So we looked in Solano County. There were no parcel taxes. That's the reason why we pulled these other neighbors up. So I kind of misspoke there. There are no parcel taxes in your county.
Do you have a sense on what the disparity or the range is and what they're getting per student?
I don't at all. Yeah, I couldn't tell you how many parcels there are to impose that tax on.
Did you ask a question about Benicia specific with the parcel tax?
Well, like it's only $50 Martinez, but $600 somewhere else, and there might be less parcels or less students.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out how much of their income is able to be supplemented through a parcel tax.
Yep. Good question. We could, I believe each district that has a parcel tax has a tab on their website about how much parcel tax revenues come in. I'm pretty sure you're required to do a parcel tax annual report. So we could probably look in Martinez. Benicia has real ballpark about 10,000 parcels. So a $50 parcel tax per year would bring in about $500,000 a year.
It doesn't move the needle on our revenue shortfall.
Very much. Not at 50.
No.
So that's the extent of my materials here.
Robert, I had a quick question, just real fast on the one-time money that the state gave. Just as a reminder, that was this gigantic initiative, which was to implement the Common Core state standards. So the reason they set aside one-time money was to do that. In those three categories, which Tim was talking about, how we're allocating that money, it's for curriculum adoptions and curricular materials. Just as a reminder, a curricular adoption in one subject area, if you went kindergarten through 12th grade, could be $1 million. They're very expensive. The next category is technology, of which we had an opportunity to infuse a lot more technology in the hands of students and staff. But not only is it getting new technology, but replacing it, repairing it. Then the third category is professional development. So again, it was around the implementation of Common Core standards, which we're still doing, and we also have this new assessment. So with all of that, and you don't have a crystal ball, and I know we don't go to Sacramento, I think, until January to get the budget landscape. Is there any indications of that one-time money continuing, reducing, is going away?
Yeah, so what I would say is during the recovery, the recovery phase of the economy, and then particularly how Prop 98 interacts with that, we were getting a lot more money than the governor wanted to acknowledge when he put the May revise together. And so during those years, there was a strong expectation that they were lowballing the revenues. And so then by January, when I'd say month to month to month, well, we were up by $1 billion or, $1.5 billion. Those dollars are going to be one time because a year it's not spent and it's accumulated over the course of the year and they owe it to us. And so the governor had, 3 or 4 years where he could put out multi-billion dollars in one-time money. I think we're kind of at the later stage of the economy, and Prop 98 is not going to be throwing off the kind of money that we had, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Because in those years we had significant ongoing growth and then a lot of one time. And the governor kind of reflected his very nature, conservative, wait till the money shows up, and then he's got it in one time, versus have a revenue forecast on an ongoing basis that kind of pushes the envelope. You fall a little bit short, and everyone says, well, now we got to have a cut here. So he's been conservative in his forecast. Probably served him well over the long run.
I mean, those one-time monies help us in these projects, but we can't use those for salaries. I mean, we still have the deficit and the salary issue. Mm-hmm.
What happens in a typical recession? It brings in less revenue. What would we expect to see? It won't be a 10%, 20% cut.
Yeah,
what's a normal expectation?
So in a more typical recession, what happens kind of in a phased level, particularly when we had a lot of categorical programs, you'd say, okay, well, let's say normally we should be getting, and this is more true years ago, 5% cost of living adjustment. Well, that sucks up a lot of money just to provide that. When the recession starts to rear its head, we say, okay, well, all of these categorical programs are not going to get a cost of living adjustment. We'll give it to special ed and then to the revenue limit. But we're not going to give it to all the other smaller cats and dogs categoricals. Recession goes into the second year, then we're sitting here saying, well, we cannot afford a cost of living adjustment to the revenue limit and special ed as well. So now we've no one's getting an increase. You get an increase for enrollment. Enrollment-driven costs go up, but no cost of living adjustment. And depending on how long it went, you could have 2-3 years worth of no cost of living adjustment. Now, for Tim and the budget people, we used to school services kind of track out where we should have been getting money had we gotten a cost of living adjustment, and where we really are when we didn't get the cost of living adjustment, which would have been flat, and during the Great Recession, absolute dollar cuts below a flat line. So we called that the alligator chart because it kind of looked like this. Here's where the COLA should have taken us. Here's where we were in actual dollars. We had this huge gap. But normally, in a normal recession, you'd see that line flat. But this was a horrible recession. We had real dollar cuts. You all felt that.
That's sort of broad, and I don't know if you have an answer for it exactly, but sitting here and just in my minimal experience on the board and learning about school finance and our expenses and the needs of staff in terms of being able to have a living wage, I feel like my hands are, well, not mine individually, but as a board and as a district, hands are so tied because there really is not enough money. Mm-hmm. And which makes me think of, what obviously we're going to do what we can with what we have, right? But in terms of like a broader perspective around legislative advocacy and people and organizations that are doing work to maybe, reform our how we're funding education in the state, which would be, for example, looking at how, the fixed Prop 13 around fixed property taxes for corporations, for example.
Right.
I'm addressing that specifically. Do you see any movement in those respects? Because, not to be a total pessimist, but it seems like we don't have enough money. We just don't have enough money, and we don't have enough money to compensate our staff in a way that's going to reflect the cost of living in this area. We don't have enough money to put in towards pensions. Yeah. But everybody has their needs, right?
So let me take it maybe in a two-step, something that I think is achievable and then a further reach, harder. So I think what's achievable is we are now reaching close to full implementation of the LCFF funding model, and we're going to be at the full target. Once we're at the full target, the only thing all districts will get is a cost of living adjustment. And the cost of living adjustment is between 2 and 3% forecast for the next 5 years. If we change the targets to go up again, raise them up like Governor Brown had when he first laid it out, we will be below the target, but we will be putting new money in to reach a higher target. That will provide year-over-year growth above the 2 or 3% range. If we have, even if you have the same level of ADA, let's say you're flat, but you would have not just the COLA, but increase toward target. So it may be, depending on how much they put into the LCFF, maybe you get, 4% increase year over year, 5% per pupil increase year over year. Now, if you have lower kids, you're right. The net dollar might not be, at least it's better than a 2%. So what I'm saying is, if they don't raise those targets, and the state takes in new money, they will spend that money on new categorical programs. They will reintroduce categoricals, and we got to be have over 40 categoricals that we folded away. Well, we will be on that path again to reintroduce categoricals, because those new dollars will need to be spent on education programs. And if it just costs a little bit to fund the COLA, then what happens with the rest of the money? New categoricals. So my first argument would be to raise the targets under the LCFF, and that's just a statutory change. The other thing that I think we, the education community more broadly, sold us short on is raising a tax for education. Now, most people would think, well, we can't get that. But the governor raised the tax, saying that we need to raise the tax. This is sales tax and the income tax, high bracket income tax, to save education. It was sold to the public as an education tax. It was not an education tax. It was a general purpose tax. And all general purpose programs, Medi-Cal, corrections, CalWorks, SSI, SSP, state parks, they all benefited by that tax. But the public was told this is an education tax. And in my view, the public is supporting education. The governor knew that. And so if we were to say, okay, this is another, now, not their appetite for it might be exhausted, but they have shown a willingness to support ongoing tax revenues and bonds for education. We just passed Prop 55 bonds, $9 billion in bonds. So the public has, in its setting of priorities, the idea that education needs more money, and we are willing to pay more money for education. Now, I think the disservice done for the state general fund in passing that sales tax and income tax was that we deceived the public. And when we go back to them and say we need a tax for education, we will hear, we just passed a tax for education. And then when we say, well, but really, we only got 40 cents on the dollar on that, then the answer is, well, then you lied to us. And I would say we did lie to them. We did not tell them that this was a general purpose tax. We told them that this was for education, and the public believed it. And because they believed it, they voted yes for it, which tells me, we might have lost our credibility when we go to them again. But the fact is, the public will support education. They will not like hearing that they were deceived and we only gave 40 cents on the dollar of those tax revenues to education. But that's the fact. That's what happened.
That's almost like the 50% of the lottery is going to come to schools.
Exactly.
We're down to what, 18%?
Yeah.
The
So
lottery money. My grandfather was actually one of the first places on the lottery, so he lived in California. So we used to have these talks all the time. He was very upset.
He was very upset because the lottery money originally was for special things, like a special art program. It was never intended to be part of the budget, and he was heartbroken when it became part of the budget, because that money was for, like, if you want to have improvements or if you needed something extra. It was for like a bonus or a plus. It was never intended to be part of the budget, and it absolutely broke his heart when it became part of the budget, because that was never the intent. Just a little side note.
Robert, can I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm just, as we're wrapping up here, this is a lot of really useful information. We appreciate it. Do you have 2 or 3 walkaways for us? I mean, so you gave us the macro to the micro. From you do this presentation quite a bit. 2 to 3 walkaways for BUSD as we move forward.
So what I would say is, those charts do show, Benicia is doing a lot for the amount of money they get relative to your neighbors. And you're in a labor competition with your neighbors. And so there are going to have to be things that are attractive to work here. And you can't say, well, we have the lowest class size. I mean, you have class sizes that you can afford, but you can't get the class sizes lower. You're going to have competitive salaries within the limits. But I think, the broader takeaway is, okay, this is a well-run district. It's, solvent. It's not facing problems. I mean, your students, all students have challenges, but, your demographics would not suggest that you have the most challenging student population. It's they're coupled together. The money side that the state provides is coupled explicitly with your student population. So, I think to the extent you can promote, your student performance and your, rising student performance over time, things like that are going to be attractive. These factors that are out of your control, I think what you want to be able to do is look ahead and understand what they are, not just to the immediate, but realize, okay, STRS and PERS are going to be, rising costs for you, declining enrollment unless that turns around. So your demographic projections are going to be very important to you. So when everyone is on the same page saying, look, these things we can't control here, enrollment, LCFF, cost of living adjustments, STRS and PERS, we all have to live with that. And that's naturally going to be a squeeze in your budget. So setting your priorities within that reality, I think, is going to be a lot easier to have that conversation than not kind of looking at that broad picture and these factors that are outside of the direct control of the board and the district. And then people could say, okay, well, I do understand these constraints that we operate under. And within that, let's do the best we can.
Do you see districts merging or reorganizing? Because I look at the long-term trend, and I called it a melting ice cube. I don't see a path forward for a district like ours with flat to declining enrollment, with low unduplicated student population, with the rising STRS costs and burdens associated with it, and the competition for labor, as you said. Even a parcel tax, if we were to get $800,000 or $1 million a year, is not going to make a difference for our district. And so there needs to be some creative other way out. I don't see 10 years from now this district looking anything like it looks like today under those fact patterns.
I think whether it's consolidation or splitting is a local issue. Because, at this very moment, we're doing a study for Santa Monica, Malibu, and in that school district, Malibu wants to break out of Santa Monica. We just did a study, down the road here for Mount Diablo. Mount Diablo had a community in the Northgate area that, Walnut Creek wanted to break out of Northgate. We did a study in San Diego County. Alpine is an elementary district. It wanted to become a unified district and take on the high school role. So, and we've done the flip side, other studies where, districts want to come together and unify. So I think that's worth looking into. And, like you point out, you do get some economies of scale with consolidation, but the challenge when you get down to the particulars is merging the salary schedules, because the state used to provide extra money in recognition of differences in salary schedules on an ongoing basis. So the state would actually put in up to 10% more money into the collective, new district to adjust for that. They provide nothing now. So it'd be a big challenge if you pay here and they pay here, or vice versa, because in the end, they're likely going to go to the higher schedule. And so, the challenge is getting everyone there with essentially the same total revenues that two individual districts get.
It just seems to me you never want to be the least paid.
Yeah.
I just don't know how we do it.
Yeah. Unification, it's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 year process. I've looked at districts, they've been looking at it for 20 years to try and get there.
All right.
Yeah, your way out.
Thank you. That's well done. Thank you. Very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me come down.
All right, thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.
Very much.
At this time, I will adjourn our work section